This conference will now be recorded.
This is the Public Assistance Applicant Briefing for Major Declaration 4483. Disaster was declared March 23rd, 2020. The name of the incident is COVID-19. The incident period is January 20th, 2020 and continuing. The purpose of this applicant briefing is to provide you information on the Public Assistance Program. We're going to review rules and procedures that are important to obligate funding and for you as an applicant to make claims. We're going to review the process for submitting a request for public assistance as well. The applicant briefing is a time, as I mentioned, to go over the rules and procedures. The next process is to fill out the request for public assistance. After that, applicant training, project worksheet development will be done. Project worksheet formulation will begin, and so on and so forth through various reviews by the state and FEMA and you as an applicant, with the goal of having funds obligated and eventually having your projects closed out. The request for public assistance notifies FEMA and the states of the intent to apply for public assistance. The request for public assistance will be completed and submitted through Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management's online system called EM Grants Pro. There is a deadline for submitting the RPA. Right now, the deadline is 30 days from the end of the public health emergency, which has not been the end date not established as of yet. Once you submit your request for public assistance into HSEMD's grants management system, the state will then copy your request for assistance over into FEMA's system, which is called Grants Portal. Once FEMA approves your RPA, you as a subrecipient will be notified. One important thing to keep in mind is once the state has transferred your request for assistance over into FEMA's Grants Portal, you will automatically be notified through an email into the email box, into the email that you've provided us on your RPA. That email is going to ask you to log into FEMA's Grants Portal. You'll have a temporary password to log in, and then you'll establish a permanent password that will give you access into the system so that you're ready to begin the process. Please submit your RPA as soon as possible. You can access the Iowa Homeland Security website at my.iowahomelandsecurity.org. Once you're granted access into the system and we begin working with you, the state and FEMA will work with you. We will be giving you some Grants Portal training. As I mentioned, Grants Portal is FEMA's web portal. So you're going to be working in two separate systems, EM Grants Pro and FEMA's Grants Portal. During this this declaration, we're going to be working on project development with you. This is a change in process for this disaster 4483. FEMA and the state will be working with you as an applicant to develop your projects and to enter in costs associated with this project. As I mentioned, FEMA will be training you on how to navigate in Grants Portal and to create your projects. Each one of us, there's three different entities here working together, FEMA, the state, and you as an applicant. Each of us has specific roles and responsibilities. FEMA's role is to manage the overall program. FEMA will be approving project worksheets. FEMA has the final eligibility determination, and also FEMA will be providing technical assistance to the state and you as an applicant. The state, Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management specifically, we will educate you as a potential applicant. We will work with FEMA to manage the program. Our office administers project funds, and we also monitor the projects that are awarded under this program. The roles of you as an applicant is to identify the work you are performing or have performed and all of your related expenses. You're to provide for FEMA to develop an accurate scope and cost estimate, which will go into the projects you're working on and developing in FEMA's grants portal. And you will be expected to manage these projects funded under this public assistance program. The public assistance program is a cost share. This federal grant has three cost shares: 75% federal share, which leaves a 25% non-federal share. Of that 25%, 10% is the state share, 15% is the local share that you as the local applicant would absorb. Once you're into FEMA's grants portal and we begin the grant writing process, you will begin formulating your own project within grants portal. These project worksheets are meant to capture the work you're performing, to provide a description of the work, the scope of work, and costs associated with all your work activities. There is a minimum project amount that is required, that is $3,300. Project worksheets are essentially divided into two categories of projects: small projects and large projects. A small project is that project which is less than $131,100. The federal share, once that project is awarded, will be paid to you automatically. Small projects are closed when all of an applicant's small projects are 100% complete. Once that is done, then the state share will be paid upon that closeout. If you incur additional cost for small projects, generally small projects are capped and there is no ability to obtain additional costs. But if there would happen to be an error or omission, or it costs you a little bit more to fund your recovery efforts, you have the ability to do what we refer to as a net small project cost overrun, which essentially is an appeal to the grant. And you must notify us 60 days of completing all small projects. A large project is greater than $131,100. Funding is based on actual documented final costs. Funds must be requested by you as the applicant, which is different than the small projects. Generally, large projects are paid out after final closeout. And once that closeout is done, the 10% share is paid. However, you can request an interim payment in the form of a reimbursement request. Proof of payment is required prior to this reimbursement. Prior to any large project being formally closed by FEMA, you can receive up to 75% of the federal share for reimbursement prior to project closeout. Various applicants are eligible under this program, which include state government agencies, county governments, which could include county conservation boards and public health or county health departments and various other county agencies, municipal governments, municipal authorities, school districts, taxing districts, Indian tribes, and certain private nonprofit organizations. This is a unique declaration that we're working through right now. There are currently other federal and state funding sources out there that are providing resources and providing funding to help different applicants recover and recoup some of the costs responding to this COVID-19 pandemic. FEMA cannot duplicate funds, so as we're in the grant writing process, creating your project worksheet, FEMA will be working with you and the state to ensure we don't have any duplications of other assistance. Formal determinations will be made when reviewing and awarding grant project worksheets, and that will be done by FEMA. FEMA is the final say on all awards. Under this under this declaration, Category B work is the only category of work that will be eligible. Essentially, Category B work is emergency protective measures, and an emergency protective measure is to eliminate or lessen immediate threats to lives, public health, or safety. And other times it's to eliminate or lessen immediate threats of significant additional damage to improve public or private property in a cost-effective manner. Since this is not a disaster declaration, there likely is not going to be too many properties that are damaged. So essentially, we're going to be looking at those costs, those work activities that are meant to eliminate or lessen immediate threats to lives, public health, or safety. Some various work activities examples are being provided here. Emergency operations centers are being opened up by a lot of county coordinators around the state. There's various expenses that can be related to operating an emergency operations center. Costs associated with operating the EOC can be eligible. These are including but not limited to increased utility costs, cost to lease a facility if one was needed, various supply costs that you've had to purchase to stand up or to operate your emergency operations center, and then meal cost as you're providing food and beverage to the folks that are in your EOC working. There's various eligibility requirements for meals, and we'll get into that in a few of the slides to come. Some additional work activity examples: emergency medical care, which would be items such as non-deferrable medical treatment of infected persons in shelters or temporary facilities, any related medical facility supplies and services, temporary medical facilities, use of specialized medical equipment, medical waste disposal, and emergency medical transport specific to the COVID-19 pandemic. Some other examples could be training, which also would be specific to the COVID-19 event, disinfection of eligible public facilities, movement of supplies and people, security and law enforcement, communications for public health and safety information, and household pet sheltering and containment actions that must be in accordance with CDC guidelines. This is a federal grant program, and under federal grants, there are a lot of eligibility requirements. And under the subject of cost, there are certain eligibility requirements that must occur in order for a cost to be eligible. That cost must be directly tied to the performance of eligible work. It must be adequately documented, must be reduced by all applicable credits, such as insurance proceeds and salvage values. I'll talk about insurance proceeds here in a moment. It must be authorized and not prohibited under federal, state, territorial, tribal, or local government laws or regulations. It must be consistent with you as an applicant, your internal policies, regulations, and procedures that apply uniformly to both federal awards and other activities of the applicant. And the cost must be necessary and reasonable to accomplish the work properly and efficiently. Types of costs you might be incurring as an applicant are force account labor costs. When I'm referring to force account labor, this is referring to your own employees that are employed by you as the applicant. These are your own employees. For force account labor cost eligibility under Category B, only overtime labor costs are eligible for emergency protective measures. That is, if the overtime is normally paid per your established policy. Any fringe benefits that might be associated with your overtime can also be eligible. In order for force account labor costs to be eligible, they will have to be properly supported. In order to do that, required is your time and effort reporting. This could be in the form of timesheets or electronic recording of your time and effort through your own system. It must be completed by each employee. It must account for 100% of all hours worked during the period of time being claimed. It must delineate each federal activity or project and all non-federal activity or normal job. What that means is you're going to be required to keep notes, whether it's on your timesheets or whether it's in your electronic time reporting system. Keep notes on the specific activities you are related to this grant, and the hours are going to have to be kept separate and uniquely identified so that they're not intermingled with all the other work activity hours. And it must coincide with each employee's payroll period. Payroll documentation that shows the actual costs and benefits will be required as supporting documentation as well. Management costs are something you as an applicant can claim. By management costs, I'm referring to those costs that you are incurring as a result of spending time managing this grant program. It is not meant to be management costs for you as an employee for coordinating time and schedules for your employees to be out in the field or responding. Those are specific project category B costs. Just be sure that you understand that management costs are for managing the time spent on this grant. FEMA will write a category Z project for you and capturing all your management costs, the time spent managing this grant. This will help reimburse you for hopefully most of your time for doing so. Activities that may be included for management cost activities would be things such as collecting, copying, filing, or submitting documents to support the claim, operating in FEMA's grants portal and EM Grants Pro, which we've talked about a little bit, preparing correspondence, possibly some travel expenses, and requesting disbursement of PA funds. The documentation requirements are the same as I explained in force account labor. Difference being that all management costs, if you're keeping track of your time to manage this grant, both regular time and your overtime hours are eligible, but the documentation requirements are the same. Equipment costs can be eligible under this program. I'm not exactly sure the types of equipment that will be used for this COVID-19 pandemic, but it is very possible that there is some. I would expect possibly like vehicles or emergency response equipment, something of that nature. Just keep in mind that you need to be tracking this equipment time, and keep in mind that force account equipment, and again, force account means your owned equipment that you as an entity own yourselves. That equipment does not go on overtime or regular time. All time that that piece of equipment is working with one of your employees, it can be eligible time, so please track that. Standby time is ineligible. If you have a cost that you normally use for like an hourly rate for that, we could use yours, or FEMA has cost codes that we can use as well that will assign an hourly rate to that specific piece of equipment. FEMA's cost codes, however, do include fuel, insurance, depreciation, and normal maintenance. But this does not include the labor to operate it, so that would be a separate thing you would need to track. Purchasing equipment and supplies to respond to this disaster can be eligible if it's necessary and reasonable. By equipment in the grants world, we're referring to equipment that has an acquisition cost greater than $5,000 and a useful life of greater than 1 year. If it's a piece of equipment, we kind of use that term interchangeably with supplies, possibly materials, but anything you're purchasing underneath or that is below $5,000 generally is not referred to as equipment for federal grants. If you have purchased equipment, just be aware that when you're finished using that piece of equipment, that equipment could be subject to a salvage deduction, and that deduction would be taken right from your project that you've developed with all your costs associated with it. Rental equipment can also be eligible. Please be keeping all of your rental invoices and contracts, and be aware that any fuel that needs to go into that rental equipment, you can request reimbursement for that fuel. That's a little bit different than for force account owned equipment. Meals, as I've mentioned before, can be eligible costs. I know a lot of the emergency operations centers have a lot of people working in them right now. Meals for those employees and volunteers engaged in eligible emergency work can be eligible, provided these individuals are not receiving a per diem and one of the following circumstances apply. These meals must be required based on your own labor policy or your own written agreement that you have currently in place, or the employees are working abnormal extended work hours without a reasonable amount of time to provide for their own meals, or this food or water is not reasonably available for the employees to purchase. FEMA only reimburses, keep this in mind, FEMA only reimburses cost of meals brought to the work location and purchased in a cost-effective and reasonable manner, such as bulk meals. If there's employees going out to restaurants, taking breaks for their lunch, that those meals will not be reimbursable under this program. Certainly, many folks are out purchasing supplies to respond to this COVID-19 outbreak. Cost of supplies purchased or taken from stock and used for the performance of eligible work can be eligible. Please ensure you're keeping track of all of your invoices, purchase orders, proof of payments, etc. Proof of payment, since it is a reimbursement program. At some point, we will be requesting that you provide us with either canceled checks or a printout from your accounting records to show that these payments have been made. You may also be taking stock directly from your stockpile. We will be asking, if that occurs, we will be asking you for records that you have in place identifying your stock. You can be reimbursed for the cost either to replace that item for what you paid for it, or for what it will cost today to replenish that stock item. Either one, it's your choice. Be aware that there are many opportunities for you as an applicant to be incurring increase for operating your facility or for providing a service. Generally, these are not eligible, even when they're directly related to the incident. There are times, however, that short-term increased cost directly related to accomplishing specific emergency health and safety tasks as part of this emergency protective measures specifically related to this COVID-19 outbreak. These may be eligible. Procurement contracting is something that is very important for all grant awards. This section is going to provide you with some general information about federal procurement and contracting requirements. Be aware that this presentation does not cover all federal procurement and contracting requirements. If you have any questions about any of the content coming up in this procurement and contracting, please refer to 2 CFR Part 200 for all of the federal procurement and contracting requirements. It is your responsibility as a subrecipient of this grant to educate yourself and make this known to yourself. Right now, we're currently in an exigent or emergency circumstance right now. It has been made aware to FEMA, and FEMA is aware that there is a public health emergency going on right now because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And FEMA is aware that there is an exigent and emergency circumstance that currently exists. What that means is that you are allowed to enact your emergency procurement policy so that you're not necessarily having to spend time because of this emergency or exigent circumstance we're in. You won't have to spend additional time trying to competitively procure goods and services to help respond to this event. You'll be able to follow your emergency procurement procedures as long as there is a public health emergency out there. As soon as this public health emergency ends, you will be notified and you will be expected and required to revert back to your normal procurement procedures. Even though you are currently operating under your emergency procurement procedures, there's a lot of rules and regulations that you must follow even with these emergency contracts. Each contract must include the required contract clauses, which is also found in 2 CFR. Generally, for construction or facility improvements, federal bonding requirements are required for those that exceed the simplified acquisition threshold. But I don't believe under this event that we're going to have many construction or facility improvement projects. It's all emergency work, category B. Be sure you're awarding your contracts to responsible contractors and that these contractors are not debarred from working and participating under federal grants. Cost or price analysis is required with every sole source procurement. Be aware that cost plus a percentage of cost contracts are prohibited. Time and materials contracts are an acceptable type of contract under federal awards. However, a ceiling must be established, and it's generally for a limited duration of time, a short-term period. Be sure that you're working with your employees and whoever is involved with awarding these contracts, that there is no conflict of interest. Continuing with procurement and contracting, state governmental applicants, it's much simpler for them. They need to be following the same policies and procedures they would use for procurements with non-federal funds. Essentially, you're going to be doing and following your same procurement you do normally. For non-state applicants, that would be everyone else that's not a state department or a state government entity. This is to include tribal and local governments, PNPs. Pay attention to this, please. This gets a little bit tricky. You must use your own written procurement procedures that reflect applicable state, tribal, and local government laws and regulations, provided that the procurements conform to applicable federal law and standards. This requirement applies to tribal governments even when the tribe is a recipient. Tribal and local governments and PNPs must comply with the following federal standards. Each contract, and this would be once you're out of your emergency situation, provide full and open competition. Each contract or each bid that goes out, bid proposals or quotations you're receiving, you must conduct all necessary affirmative steps to ensure the use of minority businesses, women's business enterprises, and labor surplus area firms when possible. If you're not sure on how to contact such businesses, if you go to the Iowa Economic Development website, iowaeconomicdevelopment.com, there on their website, they have a section for targeted small businesses. On that website there, in that location, you'll be able to search for businesses of this nature. And there are a lot of different services that these contractors provide, and it's a really good tool to use to try to find these businesses. You must exclude contractors that develop or draft specifications, requirements, statements of work, or invitations for bids or requests for proposals from competing for such procurements. This is to ensure objective contractor performance and eliminate unfair competitive advantage. Be sure in all your procurement actions in awarding of contracts, you maintain written standards of conduct covering conflicts of interest and governing the performance of employees who engage in such selection of this award and administration of the contracts. And also be sure you're maintaining your records sufficiently to detail every history of the procurement. Tribal and local governments and private nonprofits must use one of the following procurement methods. Micro purchases are those that are less than $10,000. These may be awarded without solicitation or competitive quotations, although the price must be considered reasonable. Small purchases, and these are terms used in the grants world. Small purchases are those that are less than $250,000. These are generally procured through informal methods with several price quotes being obtained. One of the previous slides, I mentioned that procurement gets a little tricky for you as an applicant. Essentially, what you're going to do is you're going to use the most restrictive procurement, either your own or whatever the federal regulation says. Under small purchases here, under federal grant requirements, it requires you only to get informal price quotes for anything less than $250,000. I'm assuming that many of you applicants have more restrictive purchases less than 250 that you must go to sealed bids or some form of formal advertising. You want to make sure you're using the most stringent rules, either your own or the federal. Competitive proposals generally are awarded based on qualifications. And again, non-competitive procurement, it's limited primarily to emergency work. And in order for that to happen, one or more of the following must apply. And as I mentioned earlier, we are in an exigent or emergency circumstance right now. Generally, for non-competitive procurement to be allowed, the item is only available from a single source. The public exigency or emergency for the requirement will not permit delay resulting from competitive solicitation. FEMA or the recipient expressly authorizes in response to written requests from the applicant or after a solicitation of a number of sources, competition is determined inadequate. And keep in mind that non-competitive procurements require documented justification to do such. These are acceptable contract types under federal awards: lump sum contracts, unit price contracts, cost plus a fixed fee. Time and materials contracts are allowed if there's no other contract is suitable. It can only be for a limited time and it must have a ceiling price. And the applicant is to provide a high degree of contractor oversight, because with time and materials contracts, there's no incentive for contractors to move quickly and save money. Just a warning to you, FEMA does not reimburse costs incurred under a cost plus percentage contract. If any of you applicants out there are currently engaged in a cost plus a percentage of contract, please contact our office immediately and we can help you through that. And again, I'll mention again, federal contract provisions are required within the body of your contract that you execute or as an attachment to that contract. Once again, please do not use suspended or debarred contractors. These contractors have been suspended for a reason and they are not allowed to work under federal awards. SAM.gov is a tool you can use to go and search for debarred contractors. As with most federal grants, there are special considerations that we need to pay attention to. Since this is a Category B only event for the COVID-19 pandemic, insurance may be the only special consideration that we're going to be concerned about. FEMA is going to require that you provide a full copy of your insurance policy. So if you haven't done so already, I recommend please reaching out to your agent and obtaining an electronic copy of your full insurance policy, because FEMA will be asking for it. The importance of this is that FEMA has to ensure that there is not a duplication of benefits related to the losses you'll claim under this grant, because FEMA will reduce eligible project costs that are insured by the actual or anticipated insurance proceeds. FEMA will expect the insurance company to pay first if your costs you're claiming are eligible under that insurance policy. You will be required as an applicant to engage in a lot of project management activities. You'll be doing a lot of record keeping. There's a lot of time limits for this grant you'll have to pay attention to. You'll be expected to report on the progress of the grant as we move forward in the process, and you may be subject to various audits. As far as record keeping goes, every applicant must establish in some form either a PA disaster specific file, either electronic or hard copy, and that file must contain the specific information for each project containing all documentation pertaining to each specific project by project number. So in this event, you may have 3 different projects. You may have a category B project. You may have a category Z project for your management expenses, and you may also have a donated resources project for donated labor. And before I forget, I missed explaining about donated labor at this time. If you're experiencing where you have folks in your place of work and they're helping you respond to this event by donating their labor, or if you're receiving donations of supplies or materials, please track those specific labor hours and materials on a spreadsheet of some sort. If it's labor, please track their name, the date they're working, and the number of hours that they are working with a brief explanation as to what they're doing. These donated hours and the costs associated with these donated resources can all be combined and used to offset your local share of your category B project. So it's very beneficial for you to track donated resources. Back to the record keeping, supporting documentation is required for all claimed costs, and everything needs to go in that file. Retain your documents for all approved work for a minimum of 3 years, or please use your own rule that's in place for your own entity. If it's greater than 3 years, please abide by that rule. At least for federal grants, it's a minimum of 3 years. And that time frame starts when your final project is completed and you have certified your actual cost. That 3-year time frame begins following that. What types of files should be in each project file? You could put in obligated project printouts from FEMA's grants portal system. That may go in there. Items such as your estimated and actual cost documentation, certainly your force account labor documentation, all your timesheets, all your payroll documentation, any printouts from your time record keeping system, any equipment you're using, the summary of all that equipment used could go in there, any rented equipment, invoices, certainly materials and purchases, all of those invoices and receipts, contracts, etc. Your insurance information should be provided and in there in your project file. Any records of donated goods and services, as I mentioned, and any correspondence possibly. If there'll be a lot of emails being sent, it's up to you. I recommend keeping track, making copies of your emails and putting them in your project file, and also any extensions or any other types of communication that you may be having about that project. There are time limits you need to be aware of. We talked about the first one here. The RPA deadline is 30 days from the end of the public health emergency. The end of that public health emergency has not been established yet, but you will be notified when that occurs. The Category B project that we'll be writing for you and you will be involved with has a work completion deadline. That is for emergency protective measures. It has a work deadline of 6 months, and that starts from the date of declaration. The state and FEMA can extend that deadline by either an additional 6 months. If need be, the state can do that. And if it needs to go beyond 6 months, then FEMA will have to make that time extension beyond that time frame. And all time extensions will come through the state of Iowa and be forwarded on to FEMA. You will also be required to submit progress reports. FEMA requires us as the state to, as we manage this program with you, we talk about progress reports, and every quarter we have a meeting and we provide for them your quarterly progress reports, which will provide a project status, your anticipated completion date, your anticipated final project costs, and any potential problems that you might be having for that project. So just be aware that every quarter you will be reporting on your projects. It's very possible that you will be subject to audits. The Single Audit Act may be one of them. That law requires that any grant recipients expending $750,000 or more in federal funds in one fiscal year is required to perform a single audit. And that those federal funds would not just be those provided for this grant program. It's all grant programs combined that you're participating in, all in the one fiscal year. You could be subject to an audit from FEMA's Office of Inspector General, often referred to as OIG. Generally, OIG covers items that are not covered in the single audit. Also, our office, Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management, we will be monitoring your project files and monitoring all your grant activities throughout this entire process with you. So be aware that the state of Iowa will be monitoring as well. Some representative audit findings: unsupported contractor costs, unsupported force account costs, which are related to your force account labor or your force account equipment. Sometimes ineligible costs are determined. Some costs can be determined to be unreasonable. Failure to establish a project file containing all documentation pertaining to each project, or you failed to keep specific source documentation, including canceled checks, paid bills, any payroll, your time and attendance records, contracts, etc. Or you failed to maintain records that adequately identify the source and application of funds provided for financially assisted activities. Failure to follow federal procurement regulations is also a very common audit finding. FEMA will be making many eligibility determinations throughout this process. If for some reason FEMA makes a decision that something, a cost, or you possibly even as an applicant are determined to be ineligible, be aware that you have a right to 2 appeals. The first level appeal goes to the regional director at FEMA Region 7 in Kansas City. Once that appeal is adjudicated by FEMA, and if it's still not in your favor, you have the ability for a second appeal, which goes to FEMA headquarters in Washington, D.C. All of those appeals will come through the state. We'll work with you on those, and those get passed on to FEMA for their review. There are timelines involved for complying with the regulation for the deadlines for these appeals. Applicants have 60 days to submit an appeal. Then the state would have 60 days after we received your appeal to submit it on for recommendation to FEMA, and then FEMA has 90 days to issue determination. These are the references that I've been using in today's Public Assistance Applicant Briefing: FEMA's Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide, 44 Code of Federal Regulations, 2 CFR Part 200, the Robert T. Stafford Act as amended, which is the law that allows the Public Assistance Grant Program to be turned on. FEMA has a website at fema.gov, and also Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management Department. Points of contact for our office at Iowa Homeland Security: our main phone line is listed right there at 515-725-3231. This is the public assistance area that we all work in here. Katie Waters is our state public assistance officer, 515-725-9314. And then myself, Rick Biondi, or Jim Granquist can also be contacted with any questions. Jim Granquist and I are the deputy public assistance officers. You can reach Jim at 515-971-5579, or me, Rick Biondi, at 515-979-3519. That completes our public assistance applicant briefing. Thank you very much for joining us.